So I'm just going to go through the little bit of housekeeping here first before we get started. One, we are recording this, so we'll be glad to give this as a recording to everybody who attends, and then you can forward it off to everybody and they can view it over the weekend. And we will be taking questions, so please type in any questions, any comments, anything at all inside the chat. I'll be monitoring that and we'll try to work them in. This is meant to be a little interactive. And kind of with that said, I'm going to let Reggie introduce himself because he's the real star here. So Reggie, go ahead.
Well, I'm getting myself of a double secret mute. I would like to introduce myself. I am the Quality Engineering Director at OptumRx. I've been in this industry from quality engineering for like the last 19 years. I've had almost 10 years experience with SmartBear, starting off with the SOAP UI product, but in the last 3 or 4 years using the Testcomplete product and a couple other different applications. So great. Short but sweet.
I like it. I'll introduce myself briefly. I'm here on the SmartBear side of the camera. So I'm Jeffrey Martin. I'm the Director of Product Management and some other stuff here at SmartBear. I've been around forever, but Reggie and I actually have talked a great deal over the years. So I was really happy to have him join us, and I'm looking forward to this. This should be fun. So guys, like I said, type in any chats, whatever you want as we go. Hey, there we go. We got the camera. I was stalling for time. Hi, Reggie.
Hi, Jeff. Yes, as Jeff said, I actually had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Martin in person. It's something that you can only dream of.
Well, anybody can, if they would like to go to our user conference. We can throw some information out there for that. They're absolutely welcome, and they're free to buy me a beer.
And I recommend the user conference. Last year, I had the pleasure of attending the first one ever, and it was a great success. There was a lot of sharing and learning from other people, so I would highly recommend it.
All right. Well, with that said, let's get into it. So, Reggie, take it away.
So today's webinar is going to be about Agile/DevOps is not a fad. So I usually like to make this interactive, but so I'm going to act like I'm talking to a class. So I apologize if I maybe ask questions and ask for some feedback. But really, a lot of people are hearing these buzzwords, Agile, DevOps. What does that mean? Especially coming from an environment where maybe you are only doing manual testing, and a lot of people keep saying, like, what is this? So I want to make sure that we express that, you know, it's not just a fad as like something that's coming and going. This is kind of sticking and staying with our industry. And so to that part, fad isn't just an actual word, it's an acronym. So hopefully over this presentation, you'll understand the objective of what fad is, what, why, and how frameworks, and what exactly goes with fad and how you can use it. Did we have any questions so far?
Doesn't look it. That's right. We just started. So I guess this is okay that we don't have any questions yet.
I just don't want to talk too fast and go too fast for everyone. So, all right. So let's talk about the objective of this presentation. Using fad, the fad methodology, we want to build a comprehensive framework, a framework that not just you can use this year, but you can use time over time, and you can really organize it and make it work for whatever company that you're working for. Automation should be built on product knowledge. A lot of people just come in and they try to automate something. If you don't really know what you're doing or understand the business case values of it, it really stops your framework from working. So make sure that the people that are working, even if they don't have automation skills, they have some product knowledge, because, you know, with the tool that I'm going to talk about today, so Testcomplete, having that testing automation knowledge is great, but having the product knowledge will help also, because you're making the framework be able to be reused by other people. And then the number one thing I would say from a leadership perspective is understanding your delivery model. If you're going to be DevOps, there's a certain way you need to deliver your code, and your automation framework should be corresponding to that. If you're going to be just agile and you're not having necessarily a CI/CD or continuous integration development line, then that should be put as part of your framework. But you should always try to go towards that DevOps model. So again, organizational goal you should have to create a framework that will be able to be used on all types of automation. It shouldn't just be, pigeonholed to one type, but be able to be plugged and played with any kind of type of automation.
Yeah, and I
Did
mean,
anyone have it? Go ahead, Jeff.
I was about to say, this is a good spot just to ask if anybody has any questions, right? At least we've defined the scope a little bit of what we're going to be talking about, but it's not completely new, right? At the end of the day, you, as the person responsible for testing your application, knows the product best, but you have to keep in mind when you're building a framework that you're going to be testing a lot of different kinds of tests. Not just UI, not just, some behind the scenes. Realistically, your application dictates your framework, and that framework should be very flexible so that it can work with anything that you're going to be testing.
Absolutely, Jeff. So let's really get into what is FAD. So, like I said before, FAD is not just an action or describing kind of a noun. It's actually how the basic methodology to build your framework. So FAD actually stands for framework, automation, and delivery. In order to make the best framework that you need to make sure that you have the framework that corresponds to delivering faster, reducing costs, and whether or not you have the delivery methodology. Automation is the intake process of it, how you automate, how you build the automation, whether it's behavior-driven or whether it's module-driven. And then, again, delivery is another factor into the FAD, because you want to make sure that your delivery model matches what your expectations are from the bigger organizational level. So why use FAD? It's really a defining process, how you define what you're looking for. The biggest objective in using this process is really to have some planning ahead of time so that you know where you want to go. A lot of times people go into building frameworks and they know at the end of the day they want automation. The question always becomes, how do you want to implement that automation, and how do you best serve your clients who are your delivery channels? So one of the things that I did with this methodology was really understanding the what, how, and why, because answering those questions really leads you to where you want to go next. So understanding the what, the process of identifying the correct framework that corresponds to automation tools that you're going to be using in your organization. So when I was asked that question from my boss before I used Testcomplete, there were several different complications. We were using a software that was built off of Microsoft Access. So it was, some deep thought around like, hey, we can't use Selenium for this one. That's the go-to model right now. Like, hey, we can just, put Selenium WebDriver on it. We couldn't do that. So I actually looked around and I called it different people. And this is when I first met Jeff. And he told me about this great thing called Testcomplete. He showed me a demo. And I said, wow, I think I can use that. So, Jeff, give me a license. Let me do a POC around it. So that's, again, you got to identify what's best going to be used for your automation tool. And then the how. You got to identify what things, you need that you can keep from the code that you already have, and what things you need to make sure that become obsolete. Like, you also have to understand your team. Who has automation skills? Who can learn quickly? Who are going to be your primary trainers and teachers? I would always identify your trainers and teachers because that's the best way to build momentum towards what you want. Even the best framework that you can, if you identify the best framework, it's easy to use. If you don't have anyone to kind of teach how to use those frameworks, it kind of just goes downhill from there, because you're spending all your time in training and you're not really getting into the execution. And then the why. You need to make sure what are going to be your SLAs, MBOs, what are going to be the things that tell you you've gotten success from that process. So with that, I'm going to stop right here and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, and while people are doing that, I might just share a little bit of insight from the other end of this, the kind of business owner. Because a lot of times I hear people who want to automate kind of to automate. That's their goal. Director of product management here. If somebody came to me and said, I want to implement automation, that's not actually a goal in and of itself. What problems are you trying to solve? In the language of the slide, what's the why? Why? What are you doing this for? At the end of the day, we all work in businesses of one kind or another, and this is a resource spend, right? This is a project. It's a framework that needs to be built. It needs to be built certainly in an effective way, but it also has to have real objectives. So to me, this is a great framework here, this FAD. What you have to identify is what problems are you trying to solve, how you're going to solve them. But to me, as a business stakeholder, the most important is actually why, because everything flows from there.
And I think that was one of the bigger lessons I learned from actually doing the work into being a manager. I got into more of the why. I like dabbling in the how and the what, but the why is really what I get judged on. So it also depends on what level you are too. So if you're the person that's getting the task, and because that's exactly how I met, how I fell into Testcomplete. My boss, he had a why, and he asked me to do the how and the what.
Which that's a pretty common way of actually approaching getting into frameworks.
So to Jeff's point, I actually learned this technique called the golden circle. What the golden circle does is you go why, how, and what, and you build it out from the inner. So you do the what first. The what is reduce cost of quality without decreasing quality. How are you going to do it? You're going to create a framework that you can quickly implement and update and use by your team. And then the why is to help deliver improved quality code for your business partners. Most of the times you can do it, the why, the how, and the what. And that's how you really get down to drilling it down from like the leadership and then to the person that's actually going to do the work. Because a lot of times when you give your team the reason why you're doing it, and you're not saying because I want you to, because you're actually giving them why and saying, hey, instead of working Saturday nights, or I have to call you in for a Sunday because it's emergency fix, maybe we have automation that someone can use from our, our product, production support team, and they can come in there and just run the automation. We have it there for them. I always have compassion around that because I was usually the person they called at 2:00 in the morning. And my wife has gotten used to if she hears the phone call at 2:00 in the morning, it's probably work. So most of the time she doesn't even wake up.
I had a really exciting social life there for a minute. Lots of calls at 2 in the morning. No.
Yeah, no social life. I work in IT. No, but that's not true. But that's the whole point of getting, around automation. And if there's any people who are managers, that's how you really sell it. Because automation does reduce costs, but it also has faster delivery, and it does cause what everyone's hoping for is this work-life balance, and that's where we want to get into.
I think that's a good point, actually, because the whys, there are really multiple whys depending on your stakeholders, right? Somebody like me, I might care a lot about reducing costs or being able to deliver code faster, right? But the actual practitioner level, there's really good reasons to build a framework. There's a lot of activities that are boring, right? A lot of times, that's something I hear. One of the reasons they're trying to build a reliable framework following something like FAD would be, hey, we want to reduce the boring stuff, the things that are kind of tedious, so that we can focus our time on the things that are more valuable. So the whys there are different whys for different stakeholders, I think is a good point here.
Within our company and our organization, we call it the blue chip value. And what that really means is what are you spending your time on? And is it the best use of your time? So that's a question that from our organization, we continuously ask. So that's one of the reasons why we really try to practice this golden circle policy before introducing something. So with that, I'm going to go to the next slide unless anyone has any questions. So I'm going to talk about what really happened in real life. So I gave this story. My boss walks in. It happened to be on a Thursday, and he said that he just had a meeting with leadership, and they have decided that they want us to be at least 50% automated by the end of the next month. And I gave him what we call the Scooby-Doo look, and it goes like this. What? Like literally, like we're 50%, and I'm like, okay. Mind you, I had only worked at this job maybe a good 2 weeks. I had a relationship with the manager before, so I kind of followed them to this new company, and I said, okay, you're giving me. And I made sure I level set with him. You want me to figure out how to get half our stuff in automation in 6 weeks, and I am supposed to not live at my job. Okay. So it was a pretty ambitious target. I'm sure no one on this call has ever gotten that what I call the Friday projects. Like this has to be done by Friday, and you get it on Tuesday. So I'm sure by a raise of hands, no one's gotten that before. And I'm being
yeah. Let us know. Actually, I love hearing these stories. Right? I mean, geez, I think we've all been there at some point, right? What's the delivery date of this project? Yesterday. But something ambitious like let's get to 50% automation by next week, basically. That's incredible.
Yeah, I frantically looked around and searched everywhere. It was mind-boggling.
Yeah, you're not the first story or the last story I anticipate hearing about that. Sometimes execs aren't always clued in when they set their goals on the high level too. We'll just say it that way. There's other pressures on them than necessarily how easy it is to accomplish.
And just because it's being recorded, and just in case any supervisor I worked for, they have always been smart and understood the timelines that they needed to give me, and they have been very good in making me the best employee ever.
It's always good. But even still, ambitious date, right? What did they give you, a month for 50% automation? That's ambitious.
6 weeks.
6 weeks.
6 weeks. And mind you, we had maybe 150 test cases at the time, so that was pretty ambitious. So, hey, you go and you do Google. The first thing is you do Google, and you kind of go to different boardrooms and chat rooms that people have, and you get opinions. So and you go to webinars like this. You actually attend these kind of webinars that you see in your email, because sometimes, I had so many great ideas from webinars that I attended from SmartBear, because people actually share real life situations. And so again, this is a Windows-based product, Access 2000. That's how it was developed. And I couldn't use Selenium WebDriver. I couldn't necessarily use that as the hard mechanism. So I found Testcomplete. Testcomplete had the three things that I needed as the lead automation person on it. It had something that could be reusable. It had a plugin into our QA Complete, which we were using already. And the third thing that I loved, it was developed in a way that was easy for me to transition to other people. The quick story on that is I actually built the framework, and then we got 3 new interns. I took that framework and gave it to them within 2 weeks, because it was, the way it was built, and we perfected it it took us a good 3-4 months to perfect it after we first started. But in 3 weeks of the interns joining, they had added maybe 60 to 70 test cases. And within 4 months, we were at 60% complete automation. We didn't make the first 6 weeks with 50%. But within 4 months, we were 60% automated because the combination of the ease of use, the way the framework was built in, architecturally, it was done well. I don't want to take too much credit for that because it was a team effort. But the most important, SmartBear has so many search tutorials, items that help every person that you give that assignment to really learn it. And that's one of the things that you have to look as part of your framework. How easy is it to pass on that knowledge? And that's one of the things that SmartBear and Testcomplete really do well. And they have so many interactive videos, webinars like this, people giving real life experience, people actually doing the seminars on how to build frameworks step by step. Those are the things that you really have to look at.
So there was 2 pieces I just want to delve into for a second. One was you didn't hit that 6-week window. But I know your story well enough to know that's because you were investing to make things a little bit more sustainable rather than just artificially hitting the goal. And obviously your bosses were coherent with that. They were on the same page as you. They understood that you have to do that. But I imagine you probably had to sell that a little bit, right?
Oh, so I see a question, and they actually hit upon one of the good things on why we didn't make it a go. So our goal was to be 50% quality engineering, the quality engineering functional test. So we looked at making it BDD. Yes, that was the correct answer. We made it behavior driven. We actually were doing kind of a Windows application that was used by our customer service center. And these customer service centers, they would get calls from customers. Customers would go through and walk through it. So when we were looking at something that was behavior driven, we were looking at something that we could mimic and make sure that the modular aspects of the code base would go with succinctly with the steps that some of the call centers went to. So we actually spent a good week sitting with the actual users. So the users of our program, so we could really get the good requirements on that. One of the things that we found out was that even when we first implemented the first phase of our automation, we would still find a lot of bugs when we did manual testing. And that's because we missed the first step that you really should look at. And that's, again, what FAD talks about, framework that mixes with your organization and what you want to deliver. We forgot about unit testing. Completely forgot about it because, that's the development thing.
Right, you miss it because it's a separate team. It's not front of mind.
And so we really focused on talking about with our delivery partners and our development partners becoming one team of coders, and that's a whole nother topic and if you're going to really embrace Agile, everyone's an engineer. Everyone's part of the Scrum process. We work together. And so unit testing and functional testing should come together. So no, at that time, I did know about Cucumber, and we did eventually use Cucumber in our Selenium WebDriver scripts. So once we got the Testcomplete automation delivered, that was kind of the easy part. What we had to do is then implement, the web-based interfaces. So that's when we went to using Cucumber and creating feature files that followed the acceptance test-driven development within our organization. So we created feature files that would call our Selenium WebDrivers that would then either kick off Testcomplete through, and that's one of the great things about Testcomplete. We were able to kick it off through 2 options, going to our QA Complete window, which allowed us to just click play for our Testcomplete scripts that corresponded to the test cases, or we kicked them off through command line. And so what we built was a command line class to kick off our Testcomplete items, because we built it on its own actual server. So we we had 4 or 5 different servers in our organization that were distinctly used to run our framework, and that anyone could log in there, they could kick it off, depending on the selection they decided to do with the feature file, whether if they used a given statement that was given that I go to the website to kick it off, or given that I kick it off through command line, the execution was done.
And I
Go
saw
ahead.
some of these other questions, and I kind of like it. We'll tie it in here for a second, because they asked, somebody asked, were we automating the feature or the user story? Could you talk about that for a second? Because your line there is a little interesting.
So when we talk about features and user stories, again, if you're in Agile, your user story is the big picture, what your why. If we're going to use the same kind of analogies, the why of what you're doing. When you create a feature file, you should have actual tasks underneath the use case that correspond to that. So the feature file include several scenarios underneath that will correspond to your user story that you're doing. So the way we did it, we used Jira, which is at that time what we used for our Agile development, and we got stories. Each story would be a feature file, and underneath that feature file, any quality engineering task would have a corresponding scenario to go with it. We used annotations on our feature file to correctly identify functional areas, sprints, and of course, what epics that these may be included. So that way, when we eventually ran to our continuous integration line, which at the time we used Teamcity, we were able to use those annotations to correctly kick off smoke tests, create smoke tests based off of annotations, create specific functional area testing off of those targeted automation, and then epic tests that we would actually run once a week. And yes, we're talking about with using, again, in Selenium, we were a C# shop, so we use SpecFlow, which is the same thing as SpecFlow is a use of Cucumber and having feature files. So I think the question that the person asked before was would their company may use what they call features when they talk about Agile development, that they get a user story and it becomes a feature or an epic. It depends on what your company wants to call it, but that's what my understanding. And then when we're talking about feature files, I'm specifically talking about the feature files that correspond to using anything that's Cucumber, aka SpecFlow. There's a couple different places for that. I'm hoping I'm answering Saj's and Ramar's question.
I think so. I'm going to go back to one thing that somebody had put in there, which is, in Agile, testers are part of the Scrum. And I think this actually goes to feature versus user story versus feature file. One just general rule, I guess, in our industry is, unfortunately, some of these terms tend to be a little ill-defined or mean something very specific to different people. So, we say Agile. I know lots and lots of organizations that say they're Agile but aren't doing Scrums. So it's very kind of messy that way.
They're called Wagile.
Yeah, Agile, Waterfail, I like that one. But, frankly, no two people develop the application the same, because no two people really have the same applications and the same skill sets and everything else. And that's one thing to keep in mind with your framework. It's got to work how you run the business. It's got to work in your environment, which is not ideal ever. Nobody has an ideal environment. So, I mean, Reggie, are your testers part of the Scrum meetings for Agile?
Oh, yes. So we were, I would say we were, well, it depends on, so in the strict fashion of Agile, we were more of a Wagile team, where we were using a hybrid model of automation. So we actually had, at the time, 10 different Agile teams. Our engineers were part of the Scrum meetings, and they would attend daily Scrum meetings, and they would be assigned tasks. So we would get stories that would at a different company, they were called features. So I at the time, before I came to the company that we instituted Testcomplete with, we actually, the company before, instead of stories, they were called features. And then when I got to this new company, they were called use cases. It honestly depends on how your company defines it. And then when we talk about being part of the Scrum team, each one of the testers would get an assignment. So how Testcomplete helps you with that is you can organize Testcomplete to correspond to different features. You can have something you can actually create yourself within Testcomplete a feature folder and then corresponding test cases that go to that just in Testcomplete. So that was one of the good things we were able to really get to 20 to 30% in the first couple of months because we had a way of, separating, hey, this feature or this user story goes to this Agile team. So each Agile team had their own folder, kind of structured it underneath that, which feature we're talking about here, or use case we're talking about here, and then correspondingly had the automation and run around it. So it's very adaptable into any kind of Agile framework, depending on how that was done.
And I think it's important to see how these three pieces, the framework, the automation, and the delivery, work together, right? Your framework needs to be made of reusable pieces so that you can quickly build those features or stories or whatever you call them in your case, a use case. Kind of the generic term I'm just going to use is requirements. It's a requirement. It's the thing you're building against. It's the thing you're testing against. A good framework leads you towards quickly being able to build the automation for those requirements. But it's also really important to keep in mind how that interacts with the delivery of the product. Which is a lot of what on the right-hand side there you're talking about, right? Where you've got a lot of Power BI based reporting that fits into your Agile sprint planning and everything else. So these all work together.
So that was one of the things that we found out too. So I'm always a continuous improvement person. So the one thing, once you build your framework, that you're going to find out is that you're going to find you forgot something. So the other thing we forgot is how do we tell people we're running automation? It's funny because it kind of should have been the first question we thought of, like, hey, we run this automation. How are we going to tell people that we actually did it? So that's where Power BI came in. And so we built a class within our Selenium Java framework that actually called Power BI and produced data that Power BI would then produce the reports. So it was all working in, because again, what made me come up with this whole process was understanding, okay, I have a framework. I know what I want to automate. Oh, I need to figure out what I'm delivering. So that's why it all comes together. So that's why it's not just an acronym for something that's just cool and hip. It's really about making sure you have those 3 points in your head at all times. So when we had new updates to our code base, we would always think, okay, we know what we want to do and adjust the framework. Okay, we know what we're going to use to automate it. Oh, how are we going to deliver it? What things do we need to ask those questions? So it kept becoming, something I would say, what's the fad around it? And and my team got used to saying, okay, here's the fad. So they would come in there if any suggestions. Okay, this is what we're going to do for this. It became easier and easier to add to our framework because everyone had that enterprise level picture about everything that was going on.
So actually somebody had a question about, hey, does this apply to not web-based testing? Absolutely. The same idea here, completely. That might change a little bit of your hows, right? How you automate that, what your framework exactly looks like and functions with, because you have different pieces you can reuse. But a little my own background, I spent 15 years in medical devices that was combination software and hardware. These principles apply, even frankly, outside of software. But within the software realm, yes, these work. This kind of approach should be how you approach automating anything for quality.
So and Jeff already knew this. My company that we implemented this into is a medical device. was a medical device company, and we not only had products that we needed to test that were phones. We had phones that we had to test. We had a web-based testing. We had Windows applications testing, and we had a virtual cloud testing that we did within this framework. So we were able to use Testcomplete and the combination of SoapUI, another SmartBear product, and use QA Complete. You know, I'm going to put the whole remit of SmartBear products out there, because that's what we use a combination of those. We use Selenium, all those kind of things. We had to go to Sauce Labs for some of our mobile, but you know, I don't want to mention any non-SmartBear products right now.
No, you know, look, at the end of the day, these are big ecosystems, and we can't solve every problem for everybody. Just we can't. That's not what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to give you some tools and a little bit of leadership in this particular case about how to approach automation quality from a bigger picture, right? By the way, we got a question here about like demos of the product and stuff like that. That's not what we're here for today. However, one thing about SmartBear is we give free trials of everything. So if you pop onto the website, you can easily grab a trial of Testcomplete or QA Complete or even SoapUI, like Reggie mentioned.
So actually, there's a demo of Testcomplete coming up in the next week. I would reach, you know, Jeff might get mad at me, but if you reach out to Jeff, he can send you the next webinar. There's a 201 webinar coming up, and I think in the next 2 weeks, I'm pretty familiar because I get the email still. And I still attend those because, you know, you got to keep your skills up. Steve asked a question about setting up Selenium servers and what kind of environment I set up. So let me go into that. So yes, there's a thing called, there's a product Selenium sells where Selenium gives you where you can set up multiple Selenium servers to kind of produce that. One thing we were not going to do was using that because we actually had Sauce Labs, which kind of does the same thing. But because we use Testcomplete, we were able to create virtual machines. Those virtual machines were, at the time, Windows 7. We eventually had to go to Windows 10. No, there was not that big of a difference whether we use IE or Chrome. Sometimes it does make a difference depending on the framework that you choose. The easiest suggestion I give you is really do an analytical dig, a statistical analytical dig on what your customers use. From a quality engineering standpoint, that's the best way to go. You have to work with, a lot of times, the salespeople, a lot of times whoever is out there talking to your customers, and identify which app, you know, especially when it comes to Windows or IE or Chrome versus Firefox, you got to understand where your customers are at with that practice. So that's what I would say to you. And yes, we were able to set up, we actually had a great infrastructure team at that company where we were able to set up 5 different virtual machines within 2 weeks of me asking them. So a part of that 6-month window, we had virtual machines set up that were able to use the Testcomplete license. We were able, again, Testcomplete allows you to, as long as, you know, depending on how many licenses you get, and I would always say getting a lot of floating licenses is the best way to do it, but I'm not here to sell anything. But when you get those floating licenses, it allows a lot of people to kind of interact and do development. If you get just one license to go on one computer, people can't, you know, I don't know about you, I had a very international team. We had people that were based in India, people based in Macedonia, people based in California, and in Central Time, Chicago. So there were a lot of different areas we had to cover. So we got floating licenses, we created virtual machines, and that was the best way for us.
And, you know, I'll share a little bit about environments because I just get into conversations about them all the time. It's important to be flexible in what you need for environments. It's also important to be a little data-driven. I've lost track of the number of people who've told me we were testing on something and it turned out nobody was using it. So in-product analytics, sales analytics, those things are really important because you want to keep the maintenance of your environments as low as possible, because every minute you're spending there is a minute you're not spending automating an actual requirement, right? That's if you're lucky enough you don't have an extra team. There are a lot of solutions out there for different pieces of environments. We sell one of them for cross-browser testing. It's literally called cross-browser testing, where we'll provide environments for you. That's a very good option for a lot of people. There's a lot of different players in that space, depending on what exactly you need. But in general, for environments, minimizing that as much as you can is always a great idea, and being very data-driven on it is extremely important.
So I want to answer one of the anonymous questions about Q-Test. Q-Test is about test case management. So again, Testcomplete is an actual automation tool around that plugs into QA Complete, which is a product that we use from SmartBear to store our test case repository.
But I'll make that a little bit bigger too. Whatever framework you build, you should make sure that that framework and the tools it uses can work with other tools, right? So because we keep talking about Testcomplete, I'll use that as an example. Testcomplete works fine with all of the test management tools, including Qtest. But we happen to also sell a test management tool, so we stitch that together very well. Obviously, we control both sides of that. But it's important when you build your framework that you're not locked in to any given tool vendor. It's something we feel strongly about here at SmartBear. We put a lot of effort into making it so that you can kind of interact in the bigger ecosystem. Because if you're locked in, you're at the mercy of that company, and that's not a great idea.
And I would agree with that. Even though we did choose to use both the test management and the automation tool, we did go outside for other items. And again, to that point, someone asked about Devops tools. Yes, Testcomplete works with Devops tools. Like I said, we had Teamcity. We also use Octopus for our continuous integration. It had a plugin there. Again, because the fact that you can run most of these scripts as long as you set them up correctly, from kick them off from from command line, it makes it really easy. The last version of Testcomplete, I remember you guys added some new features. So I'm not sure which. I can't say the last version I had was maybe 6 months back. So I don't know if you've added some new features, but I know you guys were working. Testcomplete was there, and that's one of the great things I also have to say. We had so many outside questions. And that's how me and Jeff became friends, because I would call him each week and say, hey, have you ever thought about maybe putting an API in something that you, and then, Jeff would listen, and 2 months later I would get, hey, we added that feature. So, that's one of the things, that I really, truly appreciate about SmartBear. So.
Well, that's enough of pitching our stuff, I think. Maybe we should definitely go to the next slide. I just looked at the clock and I'm like, oh, crud, we've been answering questions for a while. So
the worry was that we didn't have enough slides.
Hey.
You get me and Jeff talking. We can pretty much tell you everything about the process. But I did want to go into the topography of our framework. Again, we use Testcomplete. That was the base automation code that linked into the framework, the one automation. We use Cucumber as our ATD model so that we could have anyone start. We actually had developers do unit testing in it. And then we also, what was a big accomplishment is we had business analysts start writing their test cases in Cucumber, and we're able to call specific Testcomplete scripts and really kind of like, sorry. And really start our continuous integration line in a hyper speed, because when you get business analysts writing test cases, it becomes less of waiting for quality engineering. It becomes almost everyone owning part of quality, and that's where you should really get when you're looking at DevOps environment. Again, Testcomplete worked into our Selenium WebDriver base, and then we used different classes within that to call our Power BI reporting tool. That was, once we got Power BI, I think that was when I really started thinking we had something there, because we got reports that were specific, people could dig into them, use really kind of answer all the why questions for our upper management. So that's when we actually really got the credit for it.
So one thing I'll just throw in here is when you're building a framework, usually the focus in the business driver is about driving automation, but a good framework does two other big things. One, it's not just about automation. There's other kinds of testing like manual. But the second one is more interesting to me because a good framework, kind of following this fad outline where you're keeping all three pieces going, also starts driving business value from the communication between everybody. ATTD, BDD, there's a bunch of different models here, but the key is the communication and that everybody's speaking the same language. That actually drives business value by itself and is a function of a good framework.
And that was one of the things that happened a lot when we got the business analysts and our business, more of our business-minded folks, when they started writing automation around it, they actually saw some of the complications that they came up with requirements. They started thinking, oh, how would I make this use case to correspond to what I'm trying to sell? And then once you get everyone thinking in the same, into what Jeff was saying, everyone communicating in the same language, it really, really helps drive everything to work faster, to work smarter, and to have better quality. And for my situation, that's always what I'm trying to drive to: better quality, faster delivery, and working less and having some kind of life, hopefully.
Less. We are recording this, right? Reggie's goal is to work less. Reggie's boss.
My boss knows that if I'm doing my job, I'm working less.
I always phrase it as working on the business more and less in the business, but sure, less works.
So what types of tests? Yes, so that's a great question. The business analysts were really giving high-level tests that we were able to really break down in some of our use cases and some of our tasks within the Agile environment. So they would come up with like the smoke test, really. That we started using a lot of the business analyst code for smoke testing, because they would ask just like, so let's give a small example. If we were testing something from an application standpoint that a customer calls in and we wanted to allow customers to sign up for a newsletter. The business analyst, the first catch they wanted to do was make sure that if someone called in, they could they were able to click a flag and it would sign them up for the newsletter, and that they would instantly get an email. That's all they cared about, because at the end of the day, that's what they were selling to the client. Now, everyone knows in testing that there's a whole bunch of things that go into that. What kind of database transactions is the flag being passed on? So they were really about creating smoke tests and making sure that at a high level everything worked. Excuse me for 1 second.
Good muting. That was perfect. I do a lot of these webinars. That's not easy to do.
I try to do my best. Starting from requirement, code, test, build, deploy. Okay, as part of my, so what we did is a part of the continuous integration line was the first shot that we took at it, because we were using both our test case management and our automation tool was a SmartBear product. We had an interconnection automatically. So we actually had testers that would go to QA complete, click run, test it. And then we actually started doing groups of tests that corresponded to JIRA task or other items. So it became the beginning parts of a CI line. Once we got that part proven out, it was then for us to, kind of get our development team on the bandwagon. And then that's when we really went to the Cucumber ATD model. And that's when we built it out because we had a framework that was able to scale up. That's a buzzword that I didn't learn until I really built a good framework. Scaling to your delivery. It's the most important thing. And I actually should have made that it should have been FASD
That's not as
because
good of an acronym.
I know, but no, seriously, scaling to your delivery model is very, very important. Like I said, I think webinars are really good when people tell you the truth. Yes, we made a big mistake. We should have thought of unit testing when we started. That was the biggest mistake. And because we didn't think of it, some of our frameworks, we had to adjust because we had to figure out a way to have that continuous model. Because Testcomplete allowed us to do smoke tests, we were able to do feature functional tests for the stuff that we were testing. We had half the line built. We just forgot the first part.
I'll share, you made one, what I would call a fortunate mistake, where you didn't think about reporting at the beginning. I actually think that probably helped. Because people just design around reporting, and that's not the right way to design it. The right way to design it is to design it around your application and your process. If you do that, you can then report on it. There's always a way to report. But focusing
of course,
on
there was
report from the beginning, it tends to lead people down weird paths.
Of course, that my manager asked me, that was the first question, how are you going to tell me when your stuff is done? So I told him we'll get to that.
And that's what I mean by a fortunate piece, right? You didn't focus on that at the beginning. It kind of came up afterwards. To me, that's where it should be. Build your framework, figure out how you're going to automate things, focus on how you're delivering, and then figure out how you're going to report on all that. Reporting doesn't need to be a primary driver.
And I would say also, I hope there's some managers that's on this call too. Please be, and this is one of the things that I was fortunate to have. I had a person that was leading our team that was understanding that we knew what we were doing and gave us trust, and that we would figure it out. So that was one of the great tools that helped it. So as a manager myself now, I do give people room. And that would be a 24 or 48 hours to figure it out. But again, you still got to give people room to actually think it through. So that's an advice I would give too as well.
So I know we're wrapping up here. We only got a few minutes left. I did want to say, because we have some questions coming in. So one, anybody who wants to, because people were asking about Testcomplete, by all means, there's trials, downloads, you can go grab it. And as part of that, you'll get plenty of opportunity to talk to us. We love talking to people. We reach out. Second piece, there are some questions around BDD specifically, more or less. I'm just going to plug my own webinar next week, doing a BDD focused one, not focused on Testcomplete at all, just the practice, highlighting a few of the pieces here, just a little more in depth. And then somebody had asked, how to use Testcomplete as part of the CI/CD pipeline. So I might just share briefly, CI/CD to me is process automation. And any good framework should by itself be able to be automated. So Reggie was talking about calling from command line or APIs. There's a lot of different ways, but your test framework should by itself be able to be automated. Automate the automation, so to speak. To me, that's the real focus of CI/CD. It's a process of automation for your automated and non-automated testing. I tried to cover that in like a minute. Was that pretty good, Reggie? Fast?
That was excellent. I couldn't say it better myself.
So, I think maybe we'll start wrapping up here. I know we had one more slide.
So I think my last slide was just how we finished it, and I apologize. Today is
run.
So today is update Windows Wednesday at our company. So all our Windows updates come in today. So I apologize for that. So again, how Testcomplete helped and what was the value story. So that's one of the big things I'm about. What is the value story for anything that you implement? And the ease of training and implementation was so much a necessary evil, because again, when I came into the process, I had 0 automation testers, and I was the only one. So it was either figure out how to train other people to help, or do it by myself. And I think getting more help is always the best. It connects easily with QA Complete, which is one of the...
Boom. I think we might have lost him. It's okay. It was just about time there. I think you gotta love Windows for forcing restarts. So in any case, we only had a minute or so left. I'll close off. At the end of the day, where he was going was it was about bringing in some of the value for reuse, making sure it was easy to implement. And I guess most importantly really is keeping in mind that those 3 areas, right? The framework, how that interacts with your automation, and how that interacts with your delivery as you're building all this out. So kind of, I guess with that said, because I don't think we're gonna get Reggie back that fast. Oh, as soon as I said that, of course, he shows up. I was just gonna say, I'm looking forward to seeing you, Reggie, at Connect in October, SmartBear Connect. If anybody has any questions, make sure to email us, black us in, chat with us. And that's becoming like Google. It's a verb by itself. But with that said, hey, everybody, have a great day.
Hi, Jeff. I'm sorry. I apologize for that. That Windows update it kind of got me. So
that's what I was saying. I bet you Windows is forced to restart. But that's all right. We're actually out of time anyways, so we'll let everybody go. But Reggie, thank you a ton. It's always better to have customers on these sharing real problems and how they solve them.
And we just saw a real problem go through.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And thanks for attending, and thanks for your interaction.